This is a story that grandmothers tell their granddaughters when the masters aren't listening. Like every legend passed down from generation to generation, some details may have grown in the retelling, others may have been lost to time, and certain parts may have been embellished to make the narrative more impactful. But the core remains. In the early morning of the 31st of December, 1859, a woman named Melinda decided that the time had come to collect a blood debt. The source of this legend comes from fragments, accounts whispered by slaves who fled that night, stories told by Isaac Mackenzie, the youngest brother who survived, and memories preserved in work songs that passed from generation to generation. Two people who had nothing left to lose discovered that this made them more dangerous than any army. The last dawn of 1859 inches, Richmond, Virginia. There was no party that night, only the silent end of a dynasty built on suffering. A night when justice finally found its way through the darkness. This is one of the most disturbing stories I've ever heard about revenge and resistance in the slave-holding South. A legend that proves some people create their own justice when the world refuses to provide it. Before we continue, tell me in the comments, do you enjoy stories and forgotten legends of revolutions and slave narratives? We want to know if we should bring more content like this. And if this is your first time on the channel, don't forget to subscribe for more stories that challenge our understanding of the past. What happened on the Mackenzie property that dawned forever changed how Richmond viewed power, because when you break a person to their limit, sometimes they don't fall apart. Sometimes they rebuild themselves into something far more dangerous. The Mackenzie property stretched across 60 acres along the James River, but its true wealth didn't come from the land. It came from the trade in human lives transformed into an operation that functioned with the cruel efficiency of a well-oiled machine. Anson Mackenzie had inherited a common plantation from his father, but it was he who transformed it into something sinister. At 55 years old, he had created what traders in the region discreetly called the school, a place where problematic slaves were sent by owners throughout Virginia to be educated. The property was divided into macabre sections. The cotton field served as a respectable facade. The real business happened in the less visible buildings, isolation cabins where slaves were kept in darkness for weeks, converted stables where young women were forced to reproduce like cattle, and basement where the most difficult cases were treated with methods that defied imagination. Anson kept leather notebooks where he recorded his experiments with scientific precision. He had developed theories about psychological breaking points and tested these theories with clinical coldness. Some slaves were deprived of sleep for days until they hallucinated, others forced to remain in painful positions for hours, some exposed to constant noises that drove them to madness. His methods included what he called correction by silence. Slaves were kept in mute and dark cells, fed only watery porridge at random times until they lost all sense of time and reality. Some emerged as obedient automatons, others never recovered their sanity. Anson had installed a system where slaves were forced to report conversations of others, creating a network of paranoia that destroyed any possibility of solidarity. Children were trained from an early age to watch their own parents rewarded with extra food when they reported suspicious behaviors. The basement of the main house had been converted into a laboratory of human suffering. Anson kept instruments there that he had designed himself, iron devices that applied gradual pressure to specific points on the body, causing agony without leaving visible marks. There was also a reflection chair where slaves were tied in positions that became unbearable after a few hours. His three eldest sons had been raised in this environment, each developing distinct specialties in the art of cruelty. Bertrand, the firstborn at 30 years old, was known for his physical strength and direct methods. He had created the reflection room, a space where slaves were hung by their wrists, forced to balance on their toes to avoid dislocating their shoulders. Bertrand watched carefully, studying how long each person could resist before fainting. He had specialized in torture that left no permanent visible marks, allowing corrected slaves to be sold without evidence of abuse. His techniques included pressure on specific nerve points that caused agony without leaving marks. Bertrand had discovered that certain types of psychological pain were more effective than physical pain. He forced parents to watch their children being tortured, knowing that emotional suffering was more lasting. Philip, at 27 years old, preferred psychologically sophisticated techniques He had studied writings on mental alienation and adapted these theories for treatment of slaves. His specialty was breaking the will without breaking the body, using isolation and emotional manipulation to transform rebels into collaborators in their own oppression. Philip had created a system where slaves competed for minor privileges: an extra spoonful of food, a less dirty blanket, 5 more minutes of rest. This competition transformed solidarity into rivalry. He forced parents to choose which of their children would be punished, mothers to decide which child would receive food, creating guilt and self-hatred that lasted generations. My third son, at 22 years old, was pure sadistic unpredictability. He collected trophies from his victims: pulled teeth, locks of hair, small personal objects which he kept in a special box in his room, organized by date, and accompanied by notes about the circumstances of their acquisition. Mean had invented cruel games where slaves were forced to humiliate themselves publicly, creating spectacles of degradation that served both for entertainment and psychological control. His games included competitions where slaves fought for food, while others were forced to watch and applaud, and mock auctions where slaves had to sell members of their own families. Melinda knew every detail of this horror because she had been cleaning the main house for 8 years. She had been bought as a child along with Nora after their parents died in a fire at a neighboring plantation. During her years in the main house, she had witnessed horrors that defied human comprehension. She cleaned blood from walls after educational sessions, collected pulled teeth from wooden floors, washed torn clothes that told stories of indescribable violence. She had developed an empty, almost catatonic expression that protected her from the madness that consumed other slaves exposed to the same horrors. It was a survival mask that hid a mind that absorbed and catalogued every atrocity. Melinda had witnessed Anson conduct experiments where slaves were forced to stay awake for days, observing how sleep deprivation affected their capacity for resistance. She had seen Philip test different combinations of isolation and sound stimuli, documenting how each method affected mental sanity. During her cleaning tasks, she had found notebooks where Anson recorded not only torture methods, but also theories about heredity. He kept genealogical trees of slaves, studying how different combinations of parents produced children with specific characteristics, not only physical, but of temperament and capacity for resistance. Nora, her younger sister at 17 years old, worked in the laundry where bloodied clothes regularly arrived to be cleaned. She had developed special techniques for removing different types of stains: fresh blood, dried blood, other bodily fluids. It was macabre knowledge that no young woman should possess. The laundry was a place of its own horrors. Nora spent 16 hours a day in scalding steam, her hands becoming rough and bloody due to caustic soap and boiling water. She had developed a persistent cough due to chemical vapors, but never complained. The main house was a monument to success built on suffering. Imported mahogany furniture, Persian rugs, European crystals, all paid for with the price of human lives. But it was in the smaller details that the family's true nature was revealed. The decorative chains on the walls weren't ornaments, they were functional reminders. The family dinners were theaters of casual cruelty. The Mackenzie brothers discussed the progress of different slaves, like farmers discussing crop growth. They spoke about breaking people with the same naturalness that others spoke about taming horses. The sisters met briefly every night at the back of the property, sharing whispers of encouragement and trying to keep alive a spark of humanity. They spoke of their mother who died of exhaustion in the fields and of impossible dreams of freedom, places where people like them could walk without chains. It was during one of these nightly conversations that Melinda mentioned hearing Anson discuss a special agreement with a trader from Charleston, something about premium merchandise and special delivery conditions. The way Anson had looked at her during the conversation made her feel a chill that had nothing to do with December's cold. What she didn't know was that she had already been selected for the Mackenzie family's next experiment. A proposal that would change her life forever was already being formulated in Anson Mackenzie's calculating mind. December 1858 brought with it a cold that penetrated to the bone and a proposal that would change the fate of 2 sisters forever. Melinda was cleaning Anson's office when he called her for a conversation she would never forget. The office was a sanctuary of wealth built on suffering. Walls lined with ledger books, where human names were recorded as merchandise, maps marking slave trade routes, and a mahogany desk where sale contracts were signed with cruel casualness. On the shelves among the books were jars containing what Anson called specimens, teeth, hair, and other trophies from slaves who had gone through his correction program. The proposal that Anson presented was wrapped in civilized language, but its essence was pure barbarism. Melinda should participate in the property's breeding program, generating a child who would be sold after weaning. In exchange, he promised to sell both her and Nora to a family in the north. Quakers, perhaps, people known for treating their employees with relative kindness. Anson had developed his proposal based on years of observing Melinda. He had noticed her intelligence, her ability to remain calm under pressure, her loyalty to her sister. These qualities, he believed, would produce a valuable child, intelligent enough to be trained for specialized work, but conditioned from birth for absolute obedience. The breeding program he had developed was based on studies he conducted on animal reproduction adapted for human beings with scientific cruelty. He treated women like breeding mares, keeping detailed records of menstrual cycles, specific diets, and results from previous pregnancies. Anson had created a detailed manual for the program, illustrated with diagrams showing ideal positions, nutritional schedules, and monitoring methods. He had studied racehorse breeding and applied the same principles to human beings, trying to produce superior specimens that would command premium prices in the market. The program operated in special cabins that Anson had built at the back of the property. Selected women were kept isolated from the rest of the slave population, but connected to a central system where Anson could monitor all activities. The cabin conditions were designed to maximize controlled psychological stress. The windows were small and positioned too high to allow a view of the exterior, creating constant temporal disorientation. The temperature was kept slightly uncomfortable, and disturbing sounds were played at low volumes during the night. Anson had installed small openings in the walls that allowed constant surveillance without the women knowing when they were being observed. This constant uncertainty created paranoia and anxiety that he believed were beneficial for psychological conditioning. He kept meticulous records of each pregnancy, noting factors that affected the success of the program. His notebooks contained clinical descriptions of induced abortions, premature births, and infant deaths, all documented as experimental data to improve future productions. The breeder mentioned by Anson, supposedly Josiah from Henrio County, was actually a rotation of men selected for specific physical characteristics. Anson kept lineage records like a racehorse breeder, trying to produce superior specimens that would command higher prices in the market. That night, Melinda told everything to Nora at the back of the laundry, where the noise of water masked their words. Nora's hands had become rough and bloody due to caustic soap and boiling water. Her nails were permanently stained, and small cuts covered her hands like a map of suffering. The decision to accept the proposal was not taken lightly. The sisters spent nights whispering in the dark corners of the property, weighing options that were all variations of nightmare. Staying meant accepting that they would never know freedom. Accepting the proposal meant submitting to known horrors in the hope of achieving something better. During these conversations, Melinda revealed other details she had observed over the years. She had seen Anson maintain correspondence with traders in New Orleans, discussing theories about heredity. She had witnessed experiments where children were separated from their mothers at different ages to study the effects of trauma on personality. She had observed Philip develop psychological conditioning techniques that transformed victims into enthusiastic collaborators in their own oppression. Families were deliberately divided with members, forced to choose between the safety of some or others. Melinda had witnessed Bertrand perfect punishment methods that left invisible but permanent marks. He had studied human anatomy to identify points where pain could be maximized without causing visible damage, allowing problematic slaves to be sold without evidence of abuse. The Mackenzie property had become a laboratory of human cruelty, where every aspect of suffering was studied, catalogued, and refined. Anson kept detailed records of his experiments, documenting which methods produced the best results in terms of submission, productivity, and resale value. When Melinda finally accepted the proposal, she did so with the clear understanding that she was making a pact with the devil. But it was a pact that offered the only chance of freedom that she and Nora could have. It was a desperate bet on an uncertain future, but it was better than the certainty of a lifetime of slavery. What she didn't know was that the true purpose of the program had never been to produce children for sale. It was to break young women so completely that they would become incapable of any future resistance. The promise of freedom was just bait to lure victims into a process of systematic psychological destruction. But she would discover all of this, and when she did, the price would be paid in blood. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to follow the unfolding of this disturbing legend. January 1859 brought snow and the arrival of a man whom Anson introduced with a false name. Melinda immediately knew something was wrong. This man was too young, too thin, and his eyes carried the terror of someone who had been recently broken. His real name was Samuel, and he had been bought from a bankrupt plantation in North Carolina just a week before. The original breeder, mentioned by Anson Josiah from Henry County, had died of pneumonia 3 months earlier. Anson had simply replaced one man with another, as if they were interchangeable parts in his suffering machine. Samuel had been chosen not for superior qualities, but because he was sufficiently broken to obey any order without question. Samuel bore the marks of a recent and brutal breaking. His back was covered with scars still pink. His hands trembled constantly, and he spoke only when directly questioned, always in whispers. Anson had deliberately chosen someone traumatized, believing that fear and submission were characteristics that could be transmitted genetically. The ceremony took place in a cabin that Anson had built specifically for the breeding program. The building was a study in architectural dehumanization, thick walls that muffled sounds, small windows that limited natural light, and a ventilation system that could be controlled to create discomfort without causing death. Anson had designed the space based on observations of animal behavior, creating an environment that maximized psychological stress. The temperature was kept slightly uncomfortable, lighting was irregular, and disturbing sounds were played at low but audible volumes. The floor was rough wood that hurt bare feet, and there was no furniture except a thin, dirty mattress. The cabin had been built over an old septic tank, creating a constant and nauseating odor that Anson believed contributed to psychological conditioning. The walls were painted a faded gray that created a sense of claustrophobia, and strategically positioned small mirrors created distorted reflections that disoriented the occupants. Bertrand supervised the procedure from outside, not out of practical necessity, but as part of the psychological protocol developed by the family. His presence served as a constant reminder that resistance would result in consequences much worse than submission. During the months that followed, Melinda was subjected to the complete regime of the Mackenzie breeding program. Her meals were carefully controlled, foods rich in nutrients to promote fertility, but served at irregular times to maintain constant anxiety. She was awakened at random intervals during the night for unnecessary medical examinations, a technique that Anson had developed to break sleep patterns. Anson had created a schedule of medical examinations that were actually humiliation sessions designed to break any sense of personal dignity that remained. These examinations happened at any hour of day or night, forcing Melinda to remain in a state of constant anxiety. He used cold and uncomfortable medical instruments, prolonging procedures unnecessarily. Philip conducted sessions that he called maternal counseling, where he discussed with Melinda her future responsibilities as a mother. These sessions were actually psychological conditioning exercises designed to make her internalize the idea that her value as a person was directly linked to her ability to produce healthy children for sale. Philip had studied brainwashing techniques and adapted them for use on the property. During these sessions, he alternated between false kindness and subtle cruelty, creating a state of emotional dependency where Melinda began to seek his approval, even knowing he was her torturer. Mike contributed to the program with regular visits that followed a calculated pattern. He appeared whenever Melinda began to show signs of adaptation or hope, destroying any positive emotional progress she might have made. His visits were timed with scientific precision based on behavioral observations. During these visits, Myron described in graphic detail what would happen to the child after birth. He spoke about how she would be sold to distant plantations, how she would never see her mother's face again, how she would be raised to be even more submissive than the previous generation. During this period, Melinda began to truly understand the extent of the Mackenzie operation. She was forced to work in different parts of the property, always under supervision, but with access to areas that were normally restricted. It was thus that she discovered the basement, where the most extreme methods were applied. These basements were divided into individual cells, each designed for a specific type of psychological breaking. Some were kept in total darkness, others in constant and blinding light. Some were heated to unbearable temperatures, others kept freezing. The goal was not to kill, but to break the will so completely that the victim would become incapable of conceiving resistance. She saw rooms where Bertrand conducted experiments in pain resistance, testing different techniques to maximize suffering without causing permanent visible damage. He kept meticulous records of his methods, noting which techniques worked best on different types of personality. Melinda discovered improvised laboratories where Philip tested substances on slaves, studying their effects on personality and behavior. He had gained access to experimental medications through contacts at universities, using slaves as guinea pigs for research that would never be approved on free populations. Philip maintained a pharmacological garden where he cultivated plants with psychoactive properties. He had studied botany and chemistry, creating extracts and tinctures that produced specific effects. Some caused euphoria, followed by deep depression. Others created physical dependency. Some simply caused constant nausea. She found Myron's files where he documented psychological games, cataloging which humiliation methods produced the best results in terms of long-term submission. Myron had developed a scoring system to measure the success of different psychological breaking techniques, treating human suffering as statistical data. In the 6th month of Melinda's pregnancy, the inevitable happened. Anson had deliberately increased Melinda's physical work, forcing her to carry excessive weight, to work long hours under scorching sun, to continue even when she was visibly exhausted. It was a deliberate induction of abortion, disguised as operational necessity. Melinda was cleaning the barn when she felt the piercing pain cross her abdomen. The excessive physical work, constant psychological stress, and inadequate nutrition had taken their toll. Blood began to flow down her legs, staining the wooden floor she had just cleaned. Nora found her 2 hours later, unconscious in a pool of blood. The child had been born dead, too small, too weak to survive the brutal conditions deliberately imposed by Anson. It was exactly the result he had predicted and planned from the beginning. When Melinda woke up 3 days later, the first thing she saw was Nora's face, swollen from crying so much. The second thing she saw was Anson standing at the foot of the bed, his cold eyes studying her, as if she were an experiment that had produced interesting but inconclusive results. Anson spoke about trying again, about not giving up, about how failures were part of the learning process. Her reaction to the loss was carefully observed and documented. He was particularly interested in how different types of trauma affected future resistance capacity. It was at that moment that something fundamental changed inside Melinda. Not hope that had died with the baby. It was something deeper, the part of her that still believed that human beings had limits to cruelty, the part that still hoped to find mercy or justice in a world that had repeatedly proven that such concepts were dangerous illusions. But she showed nothing externally. She only nodded when Anson suggested she could try again in the future. She had learned that survival on the Mackenzie property depended on never revealing her true thoughts or feelings. What Anson didn't realize was that by destroying the last spark of hope in Melinda, he had created something much more dangerous. He had created someone who had nothing left to lose, someone who had seen the worst of human nature and survived, someone who now understood that justice wouldn't come from outside. It would have to be forged by her own hands. The months that followed the loss of the baby were marked by a subtle but profound transformation in Melinda. Externally, she returned to work with a mechanical efficiency that impressed even the Mackenzies. Internally, something had crystallized. A cold clarity about the nature of her situation and the limited options available to change it. It was during this period that she met Tobias, and an alliance was born that would change everything. Tobias was the property's blacksmith, a 5-year-old man whose imposing physical presence masked a sharp intelligence and patience that had been forged in 15 years of careful observation. Tobias had arrived at the Mackenzie property as a young rebel sold by a South Carolina family that couldn't control him. The Mackenzie had succeeded where others had failed, but not through traditional breaking, through something much more subtle and dangerous. They had taught Tobias that true rebellion was not explosive, but calculated. The forge where Tobias worked was a world apart within the property. It was a place where raw iron was transformed into useful tools through the controlled application of heat and force. A metaphor that was not lost on him. He had spent years perfecting not only his skills as a blacksmith, but also his understanding of the metallurgy and physics involved in his work. Tobias had transformed the forge into more than a workplace. It was his sanctuary and his laboratory. He had secretly modified the equipment over the years, creating specialized tools that didn't exist on other properties. His innovations included furnaces that burned hotter and more quietly, hammers balanced for maximum precision. As a blacksmith, he had access to all areas of the property. He needed to repair locks, fix bars, maintain equipment in all buildings. This unique position allowed him to observe and memorize every detail of the property, every entrance, every exit, every weak point in security, every behavioral pattern of the Mackenzie family. He knew when guards changed shifts, when certain areas were temporarily unprotected, when each Mackenzie was most vulnerable. He had noticed that Anson took medications for a heart condition he kept secret. He had observed that Bertrand had episodes of sleepwalking when he drank too much. He had discovered that Myron had a pathological fear of total darkness. An irony considering the methods he used against others. The loss that had shaped Tobias was the sale of his daughter, Grace, an 8-year-old girl who had been sold to a sugar plantation in Louisiana when Anson decided she was developing undesirable characteristics. Grace had inherited her father's intelligence and begun asking questions that bothered the overseers. Grace's sale had been presented as a routine business decision, but Tobias knew it was punishment for his own silent resistance. From that day on, he had become something different. Not a broken slave, but a human weapon, waiting for the right moment to be unshathed. Grace had been his only family on the property, born from a union with a woman who had died in childbirth. Tobias had raised his daughter alone, secretly teaching her to read using charcoal and pieces of wood, sharing metallurgy knowledge through games that seemed innocent. Grace's intelligence had been both her blessing and her curse. When Melinda began working near the forge, Tobias immediately recognized the change in her. He had seen this transformation before, the transition from broken victim to something much more dangerous. It was the transformation of someone who had lost everything and paradoxically gained a terrible freedom. Their first conversations were apparently innocent, discussions about work, about the weather, about small details of daily life. But beneath these simple words, a mutual understanding began to form. Both recognized in the other someone who had seen beyond the illusions that kept most slaves functioning. Tobias began to share with Melinda knowledge he had accumulated. He showed her how different metals reacted to heat, how alloys could be created to produce materials stronger than their individual components. These were apparently technical lessons, but Melinda understood the metaphors, how separate elements could be combined to create something more powerful. He also shared observations about the Mackenzie family that she hadn't made. Tobias had mapped not only the physical property, but also the family's emotional patterns. He knew that Anson became more careless when absorbed in his experiments, that Bertrand became predictable when angry, that Philip was most vulnerable when counting money, an obsession that left him completely distracted. During this period, Tobias began working on a special project in his forge. Officially, he was repairing agricultural tools for the approaching planting season. In reality, he was creating something very different. Using iron from old horseshoes and oak wood hardened by time, he forged a heavy blade with a long handle. The weapon Tobias created was not exactly an axe, nor a sword, but something between the two. It was a tool that could be wielded with devastating force, but would pass unnoticed as work equipment if someone saw it casually. He had used basic metallurgy techniques but applied with the precision of someone who understood exactly what he was creating. The weapon creation process was meticulous and secret. Tobias worked on it only during the quietest hours of the night, when the sound of the hammer could be masked by the wind. He had developed techniques for working metal silently, using hammers wrapped in cloth and heating techniques that produced less noise. More importantly, he had designed the weapon to be used by two people working in coordination. It was too heavy to be effectively handled by one person alone, but perfectly balanced for two users who understood how to work together. It was a physical metaphor for the alliance he and Melinda had formed, stronger together then either could be alone. As 1859 came to an end, the sisters' anxiety about Anson's promise fulfillment grew. They had fulfilled their part of the agreement. Melinda had become pregnant as required, and both had worked without complaints. The fact that the child had been born dead, they reasoned, had not been their fault. But Tobias, with his longer experience on the property, knew that Anson had never intended to fulfill the promise. He had seen this pattern before, hopes created only to be destroyed, agreements made only to be broken. It was part of the psychological control system that kept slaves functioning despite conditions that should have led to constant rebellion. Melinda and Tobias developed a silent communication system during the weeks leading up to the end of the year. Apparently, casual gestures that conveyed complex information, glances that lasted exactly the time needed to communicate specific messages. It was a code they had created together based on years of mutual observation and shared understanding. A touch on the shoulder meant ready. 3 taps on the table meant change of plans. A gaze held for 3 seconds meant now. It was a language only they understood, invisible to the Mackenzie, who saw them only as property without capacity for sophisticated communication. During these weeks, Tobias shared with Melinda details about escape routes he had identified. He knew paths through swamps that were impassable for horses, knew where to find temporary shelter, had identified people who could help fugitive slaves, precious information he had collected through careful conversations with other slaves. Tobias had created secret hiding places around the property where supplies could be stored, non-perishable food, warm clothes, basic tools. These hiding places were camouflaged as tool deposits or construction materials, invisible to casual observers, but accessible to those who knew where to look. When the truth finally revealed itself on the morning of the 31st of December, Tobias was prepared. He had anticipated the betrayal and had already begun final preparations. The blade was hidden, the plans were ready, and the alliance between him and Melinda had been tempered in the fire of shared loss until it became something indestructible. There would be no New Year's party that year. Anson had candled the planned celebrations, citing cold weather and business matters. The house would remain silent during the day, with only the family and domestic slaves present. It was exactly what Melinda and Tobias needed, a silent night that would be perfect for their purposes. It was the opportunity Tobias had waited 15 years for. And now he had a partner who shared his determination and his total lack of anything to lose. The alliance had been forged in the iron of necessity and tempered in the fire of injustice. Now it was time to test it against those who had created it. The morning of the 31st of December, 1859, dawned cold and clear, but there was something sinister in the air that only those who had learned to read danger signs could perceive. The sisters were called to the main courtyard at 7:00 the morning, and Melinda immediately knew that the moment of truth had arrived. The 4 Mackenzie men were present, Anson in the center, his 3 eldest sons forming a semicircle behind him. The arrangement resembled a tribunal, and the cutting cold of the morning air seemed to intensify the atmosphere of judgment that hung over the meeting. Anson spoke about the agreement with the cruel eloquence he had perfected over decades. He explained how Melinda had failed in her part of the agreement by not producing a healthy child, and how only Nora would be sold to the north as promised. The words fell like hammer blows, each one destroying a piece of the hope the sisters had kept alive during months of suffering. Anson had prepared false documents that proved Melinda had tried to sabotage her own pregnancy, fabricated evidence that would justify breaking the agreement. He presented these proofs with the same casualness he would discuss the weather, as if the destruction of human lives were merely an administrative matter. When Nora protested, reminding them that the agreement was for both of them, the Mackenzie brothers laughed with the casual cruelty that had marked their entire lives. Bertrand explained that the agreement was what his father said it was, nothing more. Philip added that Melinda knew too much about the family business to be freed. Mai was clearly enjoying the sisters' despair. Then Bertrand drew out the special whip, not the common one used for routine discipline, but one with metal tips he reserved for demonstrations. When he announced that Nora had tried to escape and would be punished as an example, Melinda knew she was about to witness her sister's murder. Bertrand's whip was a sadistic work of art, 9 braided leather strips, each ending in small pieces of metal that had been sharpened until they were cutting. He had personally designed every aspect of the weapon, testing different configurations on volunteer slaves until he found the combination that caused maximum pain and damage. What followed was a spectacle of calculated cruelty that surpassed even the brutal standards of the Mackenzie property. Bertrand began whipping Nora with scientific precision, each blow calculated to maximize pain without causing immediate death. Philip held Melinda, forcing her to watch every moment of her sister's torture. Mike counted the blows aloud, transforming murder into entertainment. Nora tried to remain standing for the first 10 blows, her determination impressive even under the circumstances. At 15 blows, she fell to her knees, but continued trying to protect her face with bloodied hands. At 20, she collapsed on the frozen ground, but was still breathing. Bertrand continued to 40 blows, far beyond what was necessary to cause death. During the torture, Anson took notes in a small notebook, documenting Nora's reactions and observing how different types of pain affected her responses. Even in the moment of greatest cruelty, he couldn't stop treating human suffering as data for his experiments. When Melinda was released and ran to Nora, she found her sister still alive, but only for moments. Nora's last words were whispered with a determination that cut through the pain. "Don't let them win." Then she died in Melinda's arms, her blood staining the frozen grass dark red. Anson approached the body, casually commenting that now Melinda had no one, that this should make her more cooperative. But when Melinda raised her eyes to him, something in her eyes made Anson instinctively step back. It wasn't despair or resignation, it was a lethal coldness that promised terrible consequences. There was no New Year's party that year. Anson had cancelled the planned celebrations, citing cold weather and business matters. The house remained silent during the day, with only the family and domestic slaves present. It was exactly what Melinda and Tobias needed. During the day, Melinda moved through the house with an efficiency that perfectly masked her intentions. She cleaned, served meals, and executed her tasks with the mechanical precision she had developed over the years. To the Mackenzies, she was just part of the human machinery that made their comfortable lives possible. But she observed everything with a precision that would have impressed a general planning a battle. Every movement, every pattern, every moment of vulnerability was catalogued in her mind, with the cold clarity of someone who had lost everything except purpose. Melinda had memorized the exact location of every weapon in the house, knew where Anson kept the keys to all locks, had identified which floorboards creaked and which allowed silent movement. It was information she had collected unconsciously over the years, but which now became crucial. Tobias worked during the day, maintaining fires and executing maintenance tasks. Officially, he was preparing the property for the intense cold that was approaching. In reality, he was executing the final stages of a plan that had been refined over weeks. The blade he had forged was hidden in a location only they knew, wrapped in waxed canvas to protect it from moisture. As night fell, familiar patterns began to manifest with the predictability of a well-adjusted clock. Anson retired to his office to review business documents, a routine he followed religiously at the end of each year. Bertrand went out to check the stables, an inspection he considered essential even on cold nights. Philip disappeared toward his private office, where he would conduct his nightly ritual of counting the year's money. My already visibly drunk, despite the absence of guests, continued drinking in the main room. He was particularly agitated that night, excited by the violence he had witnessed in the morning and anxious for more entertainment. He had begun talking to himself, recounting aloud the details of Nora's death. At 10 at night, Melinda met Tobias at the back of the property near the place where Nora had been buried in a shallow, unmarked grave. Their eyes met for exactly 3 seconds, the signal they had established. It was time to transform weeks of planning into lethal action. Tobias headed discreetly to the location where the blade was hidden, while Melinda continued her apparently normal functions. 15 minutes later, he returned, the deadly weapon hidden under a thick work coat. They had decided to start with Myron, the most unpredictable when sober, but also the most vulnerable when drunk. As predicted with the precision of a natural phenomenon, Myron stumbled out the back of the house shortly after 10:30. The cutting cold of the December night didn't seem to affect him as he headed for his favorite tree, far from the illuminated windows of the house where his screams could be heard. Tobias waited for him in the darkness, positioned with the patience of a predator who had waited 15 years for this moment. The blade descended with the force of decades of repressed rage, striking Myron at the base of the skull before he could turn or scream. There was no struggle, no drama, just the dull sound of metal meeting bone, followed by the muffled noise of a body falling on the frozen grass. Philip was next, isolated in his private office, where he conducted his obsessive ritual with money. He was alone with his gold coins, counting them methodically while savoring the power they represented. The door was unlocked. Philip never worried about security inside his own house, protected by the illusion of invincibility that wealth provided. Melinda entered silently, carrying a tray with a bottle of bourbon and a glass as if she were attending to a request. Philip briefly raised his eyes, nodded in automatic recognition, and returned his attention to the money he was counting. He never saw Tobias emerge from the shadows behind him. The blade descended with precise force, cutting through Philip's neck in a single fluid movement. Blood spurted over the gold coins he had been counting, staining them dark red in an irony that was not lost on his assassins. Philip tried to get up, his hands going instinctively to the mortal wound, but it was already too late. He collapsed over his table, the bloodied money scattering across the floor. Bertrand was returning from the stables when they intercepted him in the corridor, connecting the main house to the external buildings. He saw Tobias first noticed the blood on the blade, and his hand went instinctively to the pistol he carried on his belt, but Melinda was behind him, positioned with the precision of someone who had studied his movements for years. She held his arms, immobilizing him with a strength that surprised even Tobias. Years of brutal physical work had given Melinda steel muscles under her fragile appearance, and the adrenaline of revenge multiplied her natural strength. Bertrand tried to scream, but Tobias was faster, the blade finding his heart in a blow that was both precise and final. Bertrand looked down, seeing his own life flowing between his fingers. His eyes met Melinda's, and in them she saw something she had never seen before. Genuine fear from someone who finally understood he was not invincible, that the violence he had dispensed so casually could be turned against him. There was poetic justice in the fact that the man who had killed Nora died by the hands of those she had loved. Anne Mackenzie was alone in his office when they arrived, reviewing contracts by the light of flickering candles. Documents representing the bureaucracy of slavery were spread over his mahogany desk, like a map of the administrative hell he had created. He raised his eyes when the door opened, expecting to see one of his sons, or perhaps a servant with more bourbon. Instead, he saw Melinda and Tobias, the latter carrying a blade that dripped blood from three men who had believed themselves invulnerable. For a moment that seemed suspended in time, Anson looked at them slowly, processing what he was seeing. Then, surprisingly, he smiled, not with fear, but with something like professional admiration. It was the smile of someone who recognized superior craftsmanship when he saw it. Even when that craftsmanship was about to destroy him, he didn't beg for mercy, didn't try to negotiate, didn't offer bribes. Instead, he leaned back in his chair and studied his assassins with the curiosity of a scientist observing a particularly interesting experiment. It was as if, even facing death, he couldn't stop analyzing. "Well," he said, his voice calm despite the circumstances, "I suppose I underestimated you." There was something almost respectful in his tone, as if he were finally seeing the result of his own methods applied against him. Melinda took the blade that Tobias offered her. It was heavier than she expected, but fit perfectly in her hands, as if it had been forged specifically for her. The weight of the metal was comforting, solid, real, in a way that promises and hopes had never been. "This is for Nora," she whispered, raising the blade, "and for Grace, and for all the others whose names we never knew." The blade descended for the last time that night, forever silencing the voice that had ordered so much suffering, that had transformed human beings into merchandise, that had created an empire of systematic degradation. Anne Mackenzie died as he had lived, calculating to the end, trying to maintain control even when he had none left. When it was finished, Melinda and Tobias remained silent in the bloodied office, surrounded by documents representing decades of human commerce. Outside, the property was silent. No scream had alerted the guards. No sound had disturbed the deadly peace of the night. They worked quickly, systematically. The sale documents were burned in the fireplace, flames consuming records of human property that had defined hundreds of lives. The money from the safe was left for slaves who chose to remain, not as payment for past suffering, which was incalculable, but as practical resources to start a new life. The keys to the shackles were given to those who had the courage to use them, but reality was more complex than simply removing physical chains. Decades of psychological conditioning couldn't be undone in one night. Some slaves fled immediately, disappearing into the darkness with the determination of those who finally saw a real chance at freedom. Others remained paralyzed, unable to imagine existence beyond the limits that had defined their entire lives. When the distant bell of a nearby church rang at midnight, announcing the arrival of 1,860, the Mackenzie property was symbolically in flames. The buildings remained intact, but everything the family had built, their control system, their business network, their reputation for invincibility, was being systematically destroyed. They were the last to leave the property, walking together to Nora's grave, where Melinda knelt one last time. The earth had begun to settle, but was still soft under her knees when she whispered her final words to her dead sister. "It's done," she whispered to the frozen earth. "They paid all of them, and now you can rest." When she stood up, Tobias was holding 2 bundles he had secretly prepared over the previous weeks. Inside, enough food for several days, warm clothes suitable for winter travel, and the bloodied blade no longer as a weapon, but as a reminder that justice sometimes has to be forged with one's own hands. They disappeared into the frozen darkness of New Year's dawn, following routes that Tobias had identified during his years on the property. They didn't flee in panic or despair, but with the calculated determination of those who had executed a complex plan and were now implementing its final phase. They were never captured despite the efforts of local authorities. The investigation was hampered from the beginning by the systematic destruction of evidence they had executed. Without property records, without financial documents, without the organizational structure that kept the operation functioning, authorities struggled to understand even the full extent of the crimes that had been committed on the property. The story of Melinda and Tobias spread through the slave quarters like fire and dry straw, but not as a simple tale of revenge, was a more complex narrative about planning, patience, and the systematic application of justice where the legal system had completely failed. It was whispered in work songs that seemed innocent to white ears, but carried coded messages for those who knew how to listen. It was embroidered in quilts, using patterns that seemed decorative, but actually mapped escape routes and safe places. It was passed from mother to daughter as a promise that even the most powerful could fall, even the most silent could roar, even the most broken could rise up to break others. The Mackenzie property never recovered from what happened that night. Without leadership, without documentation, without the fear that kept the system functioning, it collapsed within months. The land was eventually sold for a fraction of its previous value, divided among small owners who never fully knew what had happened there. Isaac Mackenzie, the youngest brother who had survived by studying at a military academy in North Carolina, returned to find his family dead and his inheritance in ruins. Instead of trying to rebuild the empire of suffering, he formally freed all remaining slaves and dedicated the rest of his life to documenting the truth about what his family had done and about how that truth finally came to light. But on cold winter nights, when the wind blows through the fields where cotton once grew, watered with tears and blood, some swear they can still hear echoes of that night, the sound of chains being broken, the whisper of voices that refuse to remain silent, the echo of a blade being forged in the fire of injustice and tempered in the cold water of absolute necessity, and the name Melinda carried by the wind like a promise that justice, no matter how long it takes, always finds a way. That those who build empires on suffering eventually discover that their foundations are less solid than they imagined. That patience, when combined with absolute determination, can be the most lethal weapon of all. Some versions of the legend say that Melinda and Tobias found freedom in the north, living simple but dignified lives under false names. Others whisper that they settled in a community of fugitive slaves, helping others find the path to freedom. There are those who tell that they returned to the South years later during the Civil War to fight for the abolition of slavery. But all versions agree on one thing: they never regretted what they did that night, because when the system fails to provide justice, when the law protects oppressors instead of victims, when mercy becomes a luxury that only the powerful can afford, sometimes the only answer is to forge your own justice in the fire of necessity. The legend doesn't end with a happy ending in the conventional sense, but with something more powerful. proof that even in the most desperate circumstances, even against the most oppressive systems, human dignity can be recovered through decisive action. Freedom is not something that can be granted by others, but something that must be taken by those brave enough to pay its price. When you have nothing left to lose, you discover you have everything to gain. When you are reduced to what is most essential in your humanity, sometimes you find a strength you didn't know you possessed. True freedom doesn't come from broken chains, but from spirits that refuse to be broken. And on the darkest nights, when the world seems dominated by those who transform suffering into profit, when justice seems an empty word, when hope seems a dangerous illusion, Melinda's legend whispers an ancient truth that even the most silent person can find their voice, even the weakest can find their strength, even the most broken can rise up to break the chains that bind them. This is the true lesson of Melinda's legend. Not that violence is always the answer, but that when all other options are exhausted, when the system completely fails to protect the innocent, when patience becomes complicity with oppression, sometimes the only choice left is between dying on your knees or living on your feet. And Melinda chose to live on her feet. If this legend touched something inside you, it's because it wasn't told in vain. Subscribe to the channel, leave your mark in the comments, and share with those who carry in their blood the memory of those who dared to fight for justice when the world refused to provide it. Because some stories are not just entertainment, they are reminders that courage can flourish in the most unlikely places, and that justice, even when delayed, is never denied forever.